Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished professor at Rutgers Law School and author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. I'm also the executive director of the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race and Rights. You can follow me on social media at Sahar Aziz Law and learn more about my work at saharazizlaw.com. The Center for Security, Race and Rights, also known as CSRR, engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To learn more about CSRR's work, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR and at RUCSRR. And if you find the Race and Rights Podcast informative, please consider making a tax-deductible donation by going to our website, csrr.rutgers.edu, and press the donate button. And please give generously. In today's episode, I'm in conversation with Pulitzer Prize-winning author Nathan Thrall about his book, A Day in the Life of Abed Salama-Anatomy of a Jerusalem Tragedy. He shares powerful excerpts from his work that capture the apartheid conditions experienced by the West Bank Palestinians who live under military occupation, while neighboring Israeli settlements enjoy full rights and protection. His narrative approach moves beyond headlines and statistics to reveal the emotional and psychological toll of occupation on Palestinian individuals and families caught in systems designed to maintain separation and equality. Thrall explains the prefixed structural inequalities embedded in the segregated apartheid landscape of Jerusalem and the West Bank that Palestinians, including those within the diaspora, must face daily. Displacement from ancestral lands, violence from settlers, and systematic discrimination. Through intimate portrayals of individual Palestinians confronting institutional barriers and daily dignitary harms, Nathan Thrall's work humanizes the ancestral consequences of policies that separate communities, restrict movement, and create parallel legal systems based on ethnicity and religion. Let's hear what our guest has to say about Palestine and Israel through the transformative lens of personal narrative and lived experience.
So I thought that I'd begin by just describing very briefly what the book is about, and also a little bit about how I came to write it. And then I thought I would read a passage from the book. And, you had mentioned that I had worked for the International Crisis Group for a decade. And for those who don't know, that work is highly analytical. It's designed for a specialist audience. It is really targeted at policymakers, politicians, other analysts, journalists. And the work that they do is incredibly valuable. But after a decade of doing that work, I really came to feel that I was wasting my time. And the reason that I felt that way is that I kept having conversations with exactly the people I was trying to influence, who would tell me privately things that they never would say in public. And what they would say is, in essence, I agree with you. We are supporting a system of domination of one people over another. It has been going on for more than half a century. There is no end in sight. It is a deeply unjust system, and part of the reason that it is continuing, a big part, is the support of our governments in Europe and the United States. And yet, I'm telling you, Nathan, that I'm not going to do anything differently, even though I've come to this understanding. And the reason is the political environment just doesn't allow it. The kinds of things that I could realistically do are so tiny, you, Nathan, would laugh at them. And even those tiny things could jeopardize my job, my career, my name being dragged through the mud, at a minimum, weeks and maybe months of headache, all kinds of members of Congress calling me, advocacy organizations, making my life difficult. And so it's just not worth it. I'm not going to stick out my neck for something that really isn't going to change much in the end anyway. And I had so many of those conversations that I really felt that the kind of work that really needs to be done on Israel-Palestine right now is changing the general atmosphere in which those policymakers and politicians operate. And that means changing public opinion. It means informing people about Israel-Palestine. I think that so many normal, ordinary American taxpayers would be horrified if they took a trip in the West Bank for half a day and just saw it with their own eyes. I've seen it time and again how people do take trips for the first time to the West Bank, and it is a punch in the gut. They come away from that experience changed, and they can't really erase that terrible feeling that they have of seeing the system of deep injustice with their own eyes. So what I decided is I was going to stop doing the kind of work that I had been doing and try something entirely different, which was to give people something like that feeling, that punch in the gut that you get when you go and you see Israel-Palestine with your own eyes. And I told my editor when we started on this project that the only way we were going to make a dent is if we created a book that made people cry. And so that was really it was a real change in my way of thinking about what kinds of contributions were needed, what kinds of changes were needed here. So the story that I tell in this book is the story of a bus accident involving a group of Palestinian kindergartners in the greater Jerusalem area. And these Palestinian kindergartners live in a walled ghetto. This walled ghetto has one kind of wall on three sides, a 26-foot tall gray concrete wall known as the separation barrier or the apartheid wall. And on a fourth side, it has a different kind of wall, which is a wall running through a segregated road with Israeli traffic on one side and Palestinian traffic on the other, Route 4370, often called the Apartheid Road. And the people who live in this community, the Palestinians who live in this walled enclave of about 130,000 people, live a radically different existence from the Jews just on the other side of that wall. And when you are in this walled ghetto that has no sidewalks, virtually no municipal services, where people are forced to burn their trash in the street in the middle of the night, where there are only two exits, one through a checkpoint into the rest of Jerusalem, because part of this walled ghetto is within the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem, and the other leading into the rest of the West Bank with just one very narrow road leading from one end to the other of the enclave for 130,000 people who have to pull in the side mirrors of their cars just to let another vehicle pass. When you're inside this walled ghetto and you look through the space between two buildings, you can look directly on a different life. You can look directly on a Jewish settlement like Pisgat Ze'ev and see upper middle class single family homes, green parks. And you can look in the other direction and you can see the manicured grounds of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which overlooks this walled ghetto, where you can see people living without any services and who actually the Israeli municipal services do not even enter, even the emergency services will not enter without a police or army escort. So what you have is the Israeli authorities entering this space really only as a gendarmerie, with riot gear coming to make an arrest or to, destroy a home or some kind of aggressive operation. But aside from that, leaving it in a state of deliberate neglect. The story that I tell is of a kindergarten that's inside this walled enclave. The parents, face a choice. There's a huge shortage of classrooms for Palestinians throughout East Jerusalem, more than 2,000 classrooms that are needed and don't exist. So schools are operating in double shifts. And within this walled enclave, the shortage is especially severe. And parents have to face a choice. Do they want to put their kids through a checkpoint, confronting Israeli soldiers every morning and afternoon, a very frightening thing for parents, in order to go to some of the schools on the other side of the wall? Or do they send them to one of the few options that exist within this enclave, one of which is a private school in the town of Anata? And the kindergartners in this class had planned a field trip to a play area because within this enclave, there are no playgrounds, there are no play areas. And the kids themselves living in a system with permits and checkpoints couldn't all go just to the nearby play areas on the other side of the wall. And so what they were forced to do is to go a long and circuitous route alongside the wall through a checkpoint and to try and reach a play area in the on the outskirts of Ramallah. And after passing through a checkpoint, the school bus was struck. It was struck by a giant semi-trailer that was itself on its way to and from a settlement quarry where it was extracting natural resources from the West Bank, bringing them to a settlement factory in the settlement industrial zone of Atarot in East Jerusalem. And those rocks were being used to pave roads inside of Israel. The semi-trailer struck the school bus flipped over, it caught fire. 6 children and 1 teacher died. It was more than a half an hour before the first Israeli fire truck arrived on the scene. And who was left to deal with this blazing bus was the Palestinians who live in the area or who are using this road to go to and from work. And they pulled over on the side of the road, got out of their cars, tried with the few means that they had to deal with the fire, which, of course, the small extinguishers they had in their trunks of their car were entirely futile against the size of these flames. And some of them went in particular, one man and one teacher went in and heroically rescued dozens of children from this bus. And I tell the story of the parents and the children. The Abed Salama, the title character, is a father of one of the children. I tell of how he comes to the site of this accident. And by the time he gets there, he sees a large crowd and a burned out shell of a bus, and all of the children are gone. And he asks the people in the crowd, where are the children? And he's told many different answers because, in fact, the children had been taken off in many different directions because the people who live in this area live under a permit regime where some of them could go through the nearby checkpoint and access the superior hospitals in Jerusalem, and some of them couldn't. And so the children, just by the chance of which back seat of which car you were placed in, would be taken off in different directions, either to the Ramallah hospital, some went as far as Nablus, or to hospitals in Jerusalem. And Abed, he heard all of these different answers. The kids are at one hospital in Jerusalem, they're at another hospital in West Jerusalem, they're at the military base a minute up the road, they're at the Ramallah hospital. And because Abed himself had a green West Bank ID that prohibited him from going through the nearby checkpoint and accessing the hospitals in Jerusalem, he went to the one place he could go, the hospital in Ramallah. And it took more than a day for him just to locate his son. He called on relatives who had the right color ID to go and search for his son at hospitals in Jerusalem. And Abed is really just, one of the characters in the book. There are a number of other very prominent ones, both Jewish and Palestinian, who through their lives and also through their family histories give us a sense of what it actually is to live in this place. And the aim of the book is really to be a history of Israel-Palestine in microcosm through the story of this accident and through the family histories of the people whose lives collide in this tragedy. One of those people is a doctor and mother named Huda Dahbour, and she really represents the story of Palestinian exile. Her family came from Haifa. They were forced to flee Haifa in 1948. Huda was born in a refugee camp in Syria, grew up there, and always dreamed of returning to Palestine, which she could never do. And by chance, she married a diplomat, a Palestinian diplomat. And there was a short period of time, a small window in the early period of the Oslo Accords, when a small number of Palestinians were permitted to return not to the villages from which they were expelled, but to the occupied territories, to somewhere in Palestine. And Huda was able to go with her husband and her children and come to Palestine for the first time in her life. And she was utterly shocked by the experience of living in this place and the experience of being a mother raising children in this place and the unique challenges of being a mother raising children under occupation. And the portion of the book that I thought that I would read is really about that experience, which is such a common one, which is the experience of every parent living with the knowledge that their child can be taken away from them by Israeli soldiers at any moment. So I think that's about all that you really need to know before I start on this passage. And for those who have the book, I'm starting on chapter 10 on page 93. Jerusalem was still relatively open when Huda first arrived in Sawahre. She was able to send her children to school in the city. Below the age of 12, they didn't need a blue ID to enter. But over time, the restrictions grew, and from one day to the next, Jerusalem was closed off. On one occasion, the school buses had no way to bring the students home to Sawahre. Huda and the parents of the village spent the afternoon searching for their children, who finally showed up at sunset after walking for several hours. Huda immediately took them out of their Jerusalem schools. It was a fateful decision. Until then, Hadi had lived up to his name. He was a quiet boy who rarely got into trouble. That changed when he was sent to a new school in Abu Dis, which was home to Al-Quds University and the site of frequent clashes with Israeli soldiers. During the Second Intifada in late 2003, Israel erected the separation wall through Abu Dis, causing merchants whose income relied heavily on customers from Jerusalem to lose business. Shops closed, land values dropped by more than half, rental prices by nearly a third, and those who could afford to moved away. Israeli troops were stationed outside Hadi's school practically every day. To Huda, their presence seemed designed to provoke the students so as to arrest as many of them as possible. The soldiers would stop them on their way out of classes, line them up against the wall, frisk them, and sometimes beat them too. In her work at the UNRWA camps around the West Bank, Huda saw things that made her afraid for her sons. She had witnessed a soldier shoot a boy who threw a stone at a tank. The soldier stopped her from going to help him as he fell to the ground. At home in Sawahre, listening to the nightly news of West Bank killings and closures, she had trouble sleeping. She knew Hadi was out throwing stones. The stress began to show in her body. It started with headaches that became severe. Then at work one day, she had the sensation of cold liquid inside her head. She had double vision and difficulty walking. Back home in Sawahre, she took a nap, waking up 24 hours later. Huda understood that she had been in a coma, a sign that she might have a cerebral hemorrhage. The Palestinian hospitals in the West Bank and East Jerusalem weren't equipped to perform the operation, she was told. She couldn't afford a treatment in Israel. Finally, she obtained a letter from Arafat promising to cover 90% of the 50,000 shekels in costs, and brought it to Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. The surgery was a success, but the stress that had possibly caused the hemorrhage only intensified. One Sunday in May 2004, when Hadi was 15 and a half, he and his friends were shot at by Israeli border police, a gendarmerie that operated under the command of the army when in Abu Dis and of the police when in annexed East Jerusalem. Eyewitnesses told the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem and the AFP news agency that the boys had not taken part in any hostilities. Hadi told his mother that they had been minding their own business, drinking cokes, when the soldiers started to fire at them as if in a sort of game. One of the bullets hit Hadi's friend, who was sitting right beside him. The boy was killed immediately. After that, Hadi confronted the soldiers with new determination. Huda would see him and his friends in the street, recognizing him despite the black and white keffiyeh covering his face. She kept her distance, though, not wanting the soldiers to see she was his mother and then come to their home to arrest him at night. But her efforts failed to protect him. Less than a year after Hadi's friend was shot, Israeli jeeps and armored vehicles surrounded Huda's home. Troops approached from all sides and banged loudly on the door. Huda knew why they had come. Hadi was 16. Huda wanted to delay the inevitable, to have a few more seconds with her boy, so she ignored the banging, opening the door only when the soldiers began kicking at it. They had their weapons trained on her as she quietly asked what they wanted, tears running down her face. "We want Hadi," one of the soldiers said. Huda demanded to know the accusation. "Your son knows," she was told. "I'm his mother. I want to know." They ignored her. 13-year-old Ahmed came with her as she led the way to Hadi's room. Ahmed told his mother not to cry. It would only make it harder for Hadi. Huda tried to contain her fear, knowing that any attempt to stop the soldiers from taking Hadi could put his life in danger. She imagined them killing him there in front of her, saying that it was in self-defense. Huda wanted to hug Hadi, but if she touched him, she would fall apart. She asked the soldiers to let him take a winter coat. It was still cold. Where would she be able to find him, she wanted to know. She was told to come see him in the morning in the nearby settlement of Ma'ale-Adumim. She watched them put zip ties around his wrists, pushing him out the door and through the garden toward one of the jeeps. It felt as if her heart had left with him. For 2 weeks, Huda drove from one detention facility to another in search of Hadi, from Ma'ale-Adumim to Ofer prison to Moscovia and Jerusalem to Gush Etzion, using her unwrote work permit to pass checkpoints and enter settlements barred to green ID holders. But she never saw Hadi and was unable to learn where he was being held. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't laugh, couldn't smile. She couldn't bring herself to prepare any of the dishes that Hadi liked. She didn't want to leave her house or go anywhere she might be forced to carry on a normal conversation, as if she weren't in the deepest grief, as if Hadi were not gone. Huda retained a Palestinian lawyer with a blue ID who charged $3,000. After 2 weeks, the lawyer called to say that Hadi was being held at a detention center in the Gush Etzion settlement block south of Bethlehem and would soon have a hearing at the military court at the Ofer prison between Jerusalem and Ramallah. He was lucky to get a hearing so early, she was told. Other parents waited for 3, 4, and 5 months before their children were brought to trial and they could see them. Huda was instructed to come early for a thorough security check. After waiting for several hours, she entered a cramped courtroom. Only the military judge, the prosecutor, Hadi, his lawyer, a translator, and a few soldiers and security officers were present. The chances of Hadi being released were non-existent. The military court's conviction rate was 99.7%. For children charged with throwing stones, the rate was even higher. Of the 835 children accused in the 6 years following Hadi's arrest, 834 were convicted, nearly all of whom served time in jail. Hundreds of them were 12 to 15 years old. Just before the hearing began, Huda learned that Hadi had confessed to throwing stones and writing anti-occupation graffiti. She was told that it was forbidden to speak to Hadi or attempt to touch him. The judge would throw her out if she tried. When Hadi was brought into the courtroom, he was chained at the leg to another prisoner. Huda managed to stay silent but gasped softly as she saw a large burn mark on his face. Now crying, Huda stood up and through the translator demanded a halt to the proceedings. She was a doctor, she said, and could see that her son had been tortured. The IDF judge barked at her to be quiet and sit back down. Huda refused, insisting that Hadi lift his shirt and lower his pants so the court could see that his confession had been extracted under torture. The judge allowed it. Hadi's body was covered with bruises, as if he had been beaten with batons. Huda shouted that the soldiers who tortured him should be tried. As the judge adjourned the hearing, Huda rushed to her son, ignoring the yelling of the guards, and gave Hadi the hug she had suppressed on the night of his arrest. She imagined warming him with her hug ahead of his stay in the cold prison cell. The judge bellowed. This would be the last time she would touch her son until he was released. Hattie's lawyer, who encouraged the family to take whatever deal was offered, brought a proposal for 19 months in jail, with a reduction to 16 months for a fee of 3,000 shekels, just over $1,000. The sentence was lighter than that received by some of Hattie's friends and classmates. About 20 of them, ranging in age from 12 to 16, had been arrested at the same time. A number of the students had blue IDs, and their sentences were roughly twice as long as the others. There was a condition attached to the deal. Huda had to drop any claims against the soldiers who had tortured Hattie. In any case, the lawyer said, there was no chance of the soldiers being prosecuted. No one would testify against them. Hattie took the deal. He was transferred to the Naqab prison, where Huda visited him as often as she could. Whatever she brought for Hattie, she would bring for the other inmates as well. They were teenage boys, many of them quite poor. On her UNRWA salary, she could afford to give them gifts that their parents could not. She brought books, hoping they would help keep up the boys' spirits. Hattie's friends would tell her the names of the girls they loved, and she came back with the initials inscribed on grains of rice. On one holiday, she arrived with a tapestry of a blue sky and stars for the ceiling of their tent. Huda spent nearly 24 hours traveling for each short 40-minute visit. The relatives would sit on one side of a glass partition, the prisoners on the other. Some inmates were not permitted visits by their wives or parents or children over 15, and others were forbidden visits altogether. The prisoners and their relatives would speak to one another through a small hole in the glass, the voices barely audible on the other side. Only young children were allowed to make physical contact. Huda would watch as mothers pushed reluctant boys and girls to embrace fathers who had become strangers. The children cried, and the fathers wept too. Hattie's year and a half in prison was the hardest stretch of time in Huda's life, harder even than witnessing the bloodshed and grief in Tunis in 1985. It opened her eyes to a hidden universe of suffering that touched nearly every Palestinian home. A little over a year after Hattie's release, a UN report found that some 700,000 Palestinians had been arrested since the occupation began, equal to roughly 40% of all the men and boys in the territories. The damage wasn't only to the affected families, each of them grieving lost years and lost childhoods. It was to the entire society, to every mother, father, and grandparent, all of whom knew or would come to learn that they were powerless to protect their children. So I thought we might move from there to a moderated discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nathan. That was one of the many, many moving parts of the book. And you had mentioned that you expected people to cry after they read the book, and I think you succeeded. The most moving part for me as a parent was I don't think any parent anywhere in the world can read this book and not just feel the pain of the Palestinian parents whose children were hurt or killed in this accident. In addition to the just general daily humiliations and indignities that Palestinians in the West Bank have to experience. But I wanted to start us off with a broad question, which is, this is a nonfiction book, and you list the people that you interview for the book. And can you tell us more about what you learned about Palestine and Israel through the book writing process? I understand that you've been working on this part of the world for a long time, long before you wrote the book. But how did writing this book inform you, enlighten you? Give us a little insight or window into your personal experience in the writing process and the research process.
So, as you say, I've been writing about Israel-Palestine for quite some time when I started writing this book. And I was already, called on as an expert to talk about Israel-Palestine, to speak to journalists about Israel-Palestine. And I have to say that there wasn't a lot that I was going to learn in terms of how this system of domination works, how apartheid works. So that was really my job, was to know that inside and out, and I did know it. So for me, it was a different kind of knowledge that I gained in the reporting of this book, and it was a much more kind of emotional learning. And the main thing that I think I learned is, first of all, just how deeply this system of domination reaches into the society, into families, into personal lives and personal decisions, the most intimate decisions. I'm aware, and many are aware of, what it means to not be able to plan your day because of the checkpoint system. What it means that, you can't make an appointment and know that you'll get to point A in half an hour as you should, rather than in 3.5 hours because of the whim of some 19-year-old soldier. And this feeling of having your time not belong to you, and that it's your time is being stolen constantly, and the enormous frustration of just living at the whim of other people who control your time. Those are the kinds of things we understand are a part of occupation. But for me, what was more revelatory was learning about how, for example, Abed, at one point in his life, he was watching this permit system tighten. And he had grown up, playing in the streets of Jerusalem. He loves the city of Jerusalem. He identifies with the city of Jerusalem. And he worked in the city of Jerusalem, but he saw that this Oslo system was tightening the restrictions around his own movement and the movement of people around him. And he and his fellow co-workers were at risk of losing their jobs because they had the wrong color ID, and they would no longer be able to keep working at their jobs in Jerusalem. And there was a way around this. And the way around it was if they went and sought out marriage partners who had the right color ID. And he, not particularly, proud of this fact, but he and several of his co-workers went and did exactly that. They sought out marriage partners who had blue IDs to try and keep their jobs. And, this is just one of dozens of examples of how the system reaches into such an intimate aspect of your life, even deciding who you're going to marry. There is an Israeli economist who looked at how Israel had changed the age at which a married man could get a work permit and work in Israel, where the pay is astronomically higher than anything you could get in the West Bank. And this age was lowered so you could be a married man, a younger married man, and enter Israel to work if you were given a permit. And he studied what was the effect of just changing this little rule in an office in Tel Aviv. And the effect was the average age of marriage went down throughout the entire West Bank. So, this is just a way of answering that. For me, it was about seeing how much the system was dictating every minute of these people's lives. They're free agents. They have will. They make choices, but they make choices that are entirely constrained by the system and what choices are and aren't available to them. The fact that Abed wasn't even able to go to college because all the West Bank universities were shut down at the time that he had finished high school and wanted to go to college. It was the first Intifada. That's a decision that changed his whole life. So for me, the real learning that I did was kind of learning the depth of the pain, and how if you scratch below the surface with any Palestinian family, with any Palestinian person, you will learn so many deeply, deeply painful stories.
Yeah, and tragically, in the US context or in the US environment, no one seems to even want to recognize any of the Palestinian pain or trauma or humanity. And one of the challenges that we've been facing here is special interest groups who want only the most right-wing, pro-Israeli narrative and perspective to be heard, create this false zero-sum game or frame where if you recognize the humanity and emotions and trauma of Palestinians, you cannot do the same for Jewish people or Israeli Jews, which is false. But it's politically motivated. And so that leads me, when I finished the book and I read the epilogue, I admittedly was expecting to read something about the Palestinian characters or individuals that you highlight, but you started with a discussion about the response from Israeli teenagers. Yeah. And I feel compelled, if you don't mind, indulge me. I want to read this portion because it's so timely for the most horrific reasons. Yeah. And that it applies to the way in which we're hearing the Israeli mainstream media talk about the Palestinians in Gaza right now, who are experiencing, what I believe and many other legal scholars believe is a genocide. So I think it's important for us to remember this so in the epilogue, you bring up the reporter Eric Weiss, and he was doing a story about the car accident. And I'll start reading. The hook for the story was not the accident itself, but the reaction of young Israelis who had rejoiced at the death of the Palestinian kindergartners. Eric was dismayed by the flood of Facebook posts and online comments celebrating the loss of life. Quote, ha, 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 10 dead, ha, 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 good morning, end quote. Another quote, it's just a bus full of Palestinians, no big deal. Too bad more didn't die, end quote. Another one, great, fewer terrorists, end quote. And other quotes saying, joyous news to start the morning, and my day became sweet. So what shocked Eric was not so much the content of the post, but many of their authors freely paraded their identities as said in the voiceover they wrote without hiding behind an anonymous keyboard without shame. And a lot of the posts came from students in middle school and high school. Eric found this puzzling. These teens were living through a period of relative quiet. Some of them were too young to remember the violence of the 1990s and the Second Intifada, yet they seemed to be more racist than older generations. Eric wanted to explore why Israeli youth might feel greater hatred than their elders. And then you go on to I wanted to quote his interview with them, is that when he asked one of the Israeli teenagers about the post, the response was, quote, those little Palestinians could be the terrorist attacks of the future. Don't give me that BS that everyone's a human being. They're whores, not people, and they deserve to die, end quote. Can you unpack that? It's very jarring to read, and I want to state up front that none of this represents all Israeli Jews, and I'm not interpreting, and I know that's not your intent, but I do think that there is a very serious problem. That this isn't an anomaly. This isn't just something fringe. And I say that because many of us have been paying attention to the Israeli news. As Gaza is violently attacked, or Gazans are violently attacked by the Israeli military. And we're seeing this level of dehumanization that many of us have never seen in our entire lives. Yeah. So, I think that dehumanization, first of all, it's much more transparent now. It's much more widespread. It's much more mainstream, but it's always been there. And I think that in any system where you are, dominating over another people, and you are doing unto others what you would never accept done unto you, that the only way that you can justify that human beings justify that, is by thinking of those people as less than you, or as less than human. And so I take your point that obviously these
youth that are quoted in this news story who are celebrating the deaths of these kindergartners. They are not representative of all Israeli Jews. It's a subset of Israeli Jewish society, but it's an important stream within it, and it's one that has grown in strength tremendously in the last 12 years, since the accident. And we see it today. We see that, the center-left president of Israel, the former head of the Labor Party. The president is the former head of the Israeli Labor Party. He said in effect that there are no innocents in Gaza. So that is as mainstream as it gets to have your president saying that, and that is the environment that we've witnessed, over the last year. It's one of total dehumanization.
Can you tell us more about the response to your book beyond the praise? And again, congratulations! It's so well deserved, all these awards. But as somebody who also works on Palestine as an academic, I am all too familiar with the level of hate and aggression that it triggers, especially by those who self-identify as pro-Israeli Zionists.
Yeah.
And so how can you tell us a little bit more about your experience in terms of the backlash, if any, and what you learned from that?
Yeah, sure. So I should say that, that this book had maybe the worst timing of any book that I know of. It was published on October 3rd, 2023. And Abed and I had planned to go on tour together in the US and the UK for 6 weeks. And 4 days after the book was published was October 7th, and we faced a totally changed world, a changed environment, and over a quarter of the events for the book were canceled. These were organizations that think of themselves as progressive and liberal, who were originally planning to host us and felt that they no longer could, that even a work of narrative nonfiction simply describing the life of Palestinians under occupation was too much. At one of our events, the biggest one we had planned was with PalFest and the Palestine Solidarity Committee in London at a big venue in London called Conway Hall, and the UK police shut that one down. And they were shutting down anything with Palestine in the title. I didn't hear of any pro-Israel events that were being shut down. The pretext was, they're trying to keep calm and they worry about riots or what have you. But I didn't hear of any pro-Israel events that they were shutting down. And I've faced other cancellations as well since then in Germany, no surprise, where there's a really restricted discussion of Israel-Palestine. I think part of what's important to understand is that the way this works when you're a journalist and a writer is that there is a total imbalance in the forces that are fighting on this issue, as is the case in Israel-Palestine itself, as is the case in Washington, D.C., where you have AIPAC and a potpourri of pro-Israel organizations with lots of resources and virtually nothing on the other side. And as a journalist also, I remember that when I would write an op-ed, let's say, for the New York Times, that the editor would say to me, just so you know, like, I want to go ahead and commission this piece, but it's going to be, weeks of misery for me after it's published, because there are organizations that have full-time paid staff members whose only job is to try and get a correction for any piece that they don't like. And they know how the system works. The system works, the way it works is, the New York Times has a policy that they will take seriously any demand for a correction and they will investigate it. So they will just drain these people of resources, of time, of energy, and of the will to commission future pieces like this. And there is nothing like that on the other side. And it has an effect, when you're a commissioning editor and you're thinking about who am I going to get a piece from, and one kind of piece is headache and weeks of misery and being called an anti-Semite and whatever else, and the other is no cost whatsoever, then you are affected by it, and it changes what you commission. And so what I have felt is that because I'm an American Jew, I have a certain kind of immunity to the nastiest kinds of attacks. It's not that they won't call a Jew an anti-Semite, but it has less plausibility. And what I feel is that those of us who do have greater immunity have a greater obligation. And so, when I had the opportunity to teach a class in spring 2023 at Bard College, I proposed that I teach a class on apartheid in Israel-Palestine. That was the title of the class. I was shocked that, every major human rights organization in the world had issued these lengthy reports on how Israel is practicing apartheid, that the leading Israeli human rights and civil society organizations, the leading Palestinian human rights and civil society organizations had issued reports on apartheid. The UN Human Rights Council had issued a lengthy report on apartheid. And former Israeli officials were saying, the head of the Mossad had said that Israel is practicing apartheid, not as a future possible scenario, but in the present, Israel is practicing apartheid. And the highest legal authority in the state of Israel, the former attorney general, said the same thing. And all of this was coming together, and there was not a single course in the world about apartheid in Israel-Palestine. And I know that the kind of faculty, Arab American, Muslim American faculty, who might like to teach that class would be putting a lot at risk by doing that and might end their careers. And so here I was with an opportunity to do it, and I wasn't seeking a permanent teaching position also, which gave me added sense of immunity. And so I taught that class, and there was indeed a backlash, and there was an attempt by the ADL and the Israeli consulate in New York to pressure Bard to shut down the class. They tried to claim that the title of the class itself was anti-Semitic and in violation of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is the favored definition by Israel and pro-Israel groups to try and shut down criticism of Israel and define it as anti-Semitic. And, Bard lost $2.5 million. A donor pulled out $2.5 million because of this course. But to their great credit, Bard stood by me, and the course went ahead, and the students loved it. And so, I think that we are still, despite this massive shift in public opinion that we've seen in the last year, which is really, really important and quite inspiring, I think we also need to recognize that we're still living in a world in which all the power is on one side of this. And so I feel that people who do have the relative immunity, like I do, ought to use that.
In the critical race theory space, we call that privilege.
Right.
Privilege.
That's
and
right.
I do agree, when you have privilege, you do have responsibility in whatever specific context you have the privilege. So thank you for explaining that. I can't help but also note, as a civil rights lawyer and scholar, that freedom has never been free for the oppressed. And if you look at, Black people did not get their civil rights without having to deal with an enormous amount of oppression and violence and disparities of power by white supremacists. Women did not get the right to vote without three, intergenerational struggle for suffrage against white men primarily, who did not want them to vote. And so I think it's important for us to also see what is happening right now through an American civil rights lens, because it is unfortunate, but there are people and groups. And now you're saying even the Israeli embassy, so you've got a foreign state intervening in your experience, that are acting as bullies and that are exercising the privilege that comes with wealth, privilege that may come with being elected to political office, and the privilege that comes with being raised as white especially in comparison to Palestinians, Muslims, Arabs who are raced as brown and raced as terrorist threats and subjected to all forms of different forms of subordination and oppression. So I think we need to name this. And one silver lining is the coalition building among young people, especially Jewish college students and Muslim and Arab and Black and Latino, who see what's happening in Palestine as an affront to universal basic human rights. And not a Jewish problem or a Muslim problem. It's a human problem. And so I think it's important. And I'll just remind everyone what I said at the beginning of my introduction, just hosting you, Nathan, here and having the Center for Security, Race, and Rights reject the Palestine exception, reject the dehumanization of Palestinians, has caused us and me personally to be under a severe attack. And, for those who are listening, we need your support. Make the donation. csrr.rutgers.edu, press the donate button. We can't afford to be silent while our fundamental American values are being threatened by groups who clearly just don't believe in those values. And I think they're a threat to our democracy on multiple levels. So let me go to the audience questions. We have one question about the settlers. Can you talk a bit more about the settlers? Well, I thought that they are mainly ideologues. It seems that they appear to be motivated by a variety of reasons, including economically. And specifically, can you explain how Danny, while speaking of peace, he was simultaneously a settler and a leader in the manufacturing of the apartheid system?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So just to break it down numerically, about 1 in 10 Israeli Jews live in the occupied territories. And their lives are basically like the lives of any Israelis anywhere. The whole project is based on suburbanization. It is to make it so that the settlements feel no different than any other suburb in Israel. And indeed, they do not. You travel from a settlement to a workplace inside of Israel, and it's seamless. And when you enter the settlement, you don't feel like you've, crossed a border, that you've left Israel. You see the same, municipal signs. You see police stations. You see the fire stations. You see the same health clinics. You see public schools. You see courts. You see shopping malls. So it all feels like just a suburb. And therefore, you have many people who are living there just because they can have a bigger and nicer home for less money. And there are all kinds of subsidies that the state gives to incentivize more people to move into the settlements. This is the biggest project of the state of Israel in its history. And we're often exposed in the Western media to a kind of analysis or framing that portrays the settlements or settlers as a bunch of rogues, ideological fanatics who have, subjected the state of Israel to their will. They've twisted the arm of the state to pursue their, special interest agenda, when in fact, this is a project of the Israeli government, every Israeli government since the occupation began, left, right, and center. And about a third of the settlers are what are called quality of life settlers, people who just moved there for the larger home and no other reason. About a third are ultra-Orthodox who live really concentrated in 2 extremely large settlements and a couple of others as well. And then another third are the more ideological ones. But these lines tend to blur because once you've already moved for quality of life reasons, then you start to justify it and you start to, become more of an ideological settler, to start to justify what you're doing. The question asked about one character in particular whose name is Danny Tirza. And he is himself a settler who is a leading expert on maps and territory. He is a colonel in the reserves of the IDF, and he is the one who created the maps of Oslo that divide up the West Bank into the fragments that we know today. So the West Bank is divided up into three zones, Area A, B, and C, as well as annexed East Jerusalem. And basically, Area C is where all of the settlers are, and all of the settler roads, and all of the settlement infrastructure, and all of the Israeli military bases, and all the Israeli military firing zones. Anywhere where you'd see Israeli civilians in the West Bank is Area C, and that is, not surprisingly, the largest area. It's 60%, 62% of the West Bank, and it is contiguous. And within that 62% are 165 little islands that are defined as Area A and B, where you have limited Palestinian autonomy. And just to give a global sense of this, in the territory of Israel-Palestine, the areas of Palestinian limited autonomy, and when I say limited, I mean really limited. The Israeli army enters these areas every night and makes arrests and does it what it wishes. But those areas of limited Palestinian autonomy, those 165 islands within the West Bank, plus Gaza, together constitute only 10% of the territory under Israel's control. That's all we're talking about. So the rest is annexed East Jerusalem, Israel within its pre-1967 borders, which is 78% of Israel-Palestine, and then Area C, which is 62% of the West Bank. Danny, he lives in a settlement that is deep, deep inside the West Bank, but he, as a leading map expert, and he's also the architect of the wall that encloses the Palestinian families who were involved in this accident, who the parents and the children who were involved in this school bus accident. So Danny routed the wall, he designed the wall. He's really been central to creating the physical infrastructure of the West Bank as we know it today. And because of that expertise, he's been involved in all of the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations that have taken place, and he's been called in as a map expert to participate in those. And you see that his basic perspective is that, the Palestinians are the weaker party. And in any negotiation, the weaker party is not in a position to make really any kind of demands, and they're lucky to be getting anything because, frankly, Israel doesn't really need to give them anything. And so he conceives of himself as magnanimous and as a peacemaker and somebody who really wants there to be an arrangement. It's just, so unreasonable that the Palestinians haven't accepted the scraps that have been offered to them. And I think that this is something that's, very, very common. We don't really appreciate the degree to which, the people who are involved in an unjust system, who are central ideologues of it or operatives within it, conceive of themselves as acting entirely morally.
Right. I think that is one of the challenges when you have these types of injustice, this type of injustice where people get so vested in benefiting from it. And I don't, the US is not immune to that as well as any other country. So we have time for one more question. We have a number of questions that are really asking about the American context and how can we humanize Palestinians in America? How can, what are the best steps or best practices or advice that you have that allows Americans to understand more about what's happening in the West Bank and Gaza, and to humanize Palestinians, and to not only be exposed to one side in a very far right-wing version of the pro-Israeli side? Do you have any advice for people who would like to be part of the solution to ensure that Palestinians are treated as equals?
Yeah. So I think that that question could be answered on a couple of different levels. One is on a kind of more personal one, which is influencing your friends and your family and the people who are around you. And I think a big contribution that we can make is to share Palestinian stories with them, to share films about and by Palestinians, to share books by and about Palestinians. I think those can be very powerful in opening people's eyes. I think so much of the problem that we face in the United States is that many of the people who are pro-Israel in orientation, basically the mainstream, every TV anchor you see, they're not even aware that they're biased. They actually have been being raised in the American system and in mainstream American institutions. You were taught essentially a liberal Zionist point of view. And that narrative, which is basically to make a false equivalence between occupier and occupied, between subjugated and subjugator, to say that this is just a tragic, conflict that is thousands of years old between two peoples who have equal rights to the land and simply can't agree on a border and can't share it. There are all of these kinds of false equivalences that are made in that narrative, and the mainstream gatekeepers who believe that narrative don't even recognize that it is an ideological point of view. And they think that anything that veers from it is the ideological one. And so I think that just very basic, education, explaining to people that this isn't a 1,000 years old conflict. This is a conflict that began, with a political idea that emerged in Europe called Zionism. And that idea, resulted in the first settlement by European Jews in Palestine in 1882. And at that time, the Jewish population in Palestine was 3 to 5%. And, this conflict is about that. Was there any way, was it just for Jews to say, we are going to establish a state in Palestine against the will of that 95% native majority? That's what this conflict is about. And so I think that just, educating people about these very basic facts can really go a long way. And then, at a different level, I think that, we can also be doing more in terms of our personal decisions and our activism and the kinds of things that we choose to invest or not invest in. And, I think that there could be a lot more organizing done in terms of divesting from companies that are profiting from this deeply unjust system. And, I know that I'm speaking to you here. This is a university. I know that many schools have passed divestment initiatives, and the student bodies have passed them, and then it goes up to the board. And each time the people with the power say, no, thank you, we're not going to do it. But I know of at least one case in which a group of students went around this, and they passed a divestment resolution at their school. The board said, no, thank you, we're not going to implement it. And then they graduated. And when they graduated, they started to receive letters in the mail saying, you are now an alumnus, and please donate to your alma mater. And so a group of these students who passed the divestment initiative got together, and they joined forces with people who had been involved in divestment on other issues, on fossil fuels and environmental justice. And they all got together and they said, let's pool our money together. Not much. It was probably their parents' money. A group of 50 people, each parent $1,000. They've got $50,000. And they come to the school and say, we've got $50,000. And we recognize that we can't, with this small sum of money, get you to change your whole investment portfolio. However, we would like you to set aside our contribution and invest it differently, because we can't give money and have it go toward these companies that are profiting from occupation and fossil fuel companies, et cetera. And the school, the attitude of all of these development departments at any institution where they're raising money is basically the donor is always right. And so the school said, yes, we will happily take your $50,000 and we will invest it in one of these zillions of socially responsible investment vehicles. And we will specify that it will not go to companies X, Y, and Z. And they set a precedent. And that's something that could be repeated at schools all over the country. And from there, you can start to actually, each school starts to have two investment vehicles, and you can start to actually pressure for more and more of the money to go into the socially responsible one. I think there's a lot that can be done in the realm of divestment that hasn't been done yet.
Well, thank you so much. I will say before we close that even just saying the word divestment gets causes all sorts of name calling to occur, and the most common being that you're anti-Semitic. Meanwhile, those same people don't seem to have a problem with the boycotting of fossil fuel companies or the boycotting of companies that have demonstrated human rights violations in how they conduct business, especially in developing countries, or engage in violations of labor, basic labor practices. So I think that it's important for us to recognize that divestment is a common nonviolent form of political opposition. And obviously the most high profile one that was ultimately successful was the divestment movement and boycott divestment movement against South Africa for its boycott, for its apartheid of Black people. So just to point out, this is not about Israeli exceptionalism. This is one method that is used nonviolently to act on and express one's political position.
Well, I would say it is about Israeli exceptionalism in the sense that what is exceptional here is that we have a group of liberals in the United States who are bending over backward to defend a gross violator of human rights and to defend the U.S.'s funding of those human rights violations. So what's really is exceptional in this case is the degree to which the U.S. is actively supporting the very things it purports to stand in opposition to. We are horrified at what's happening in Xinjiang, but the U.S. isn't financing that.
Thank you so much, Nathan. We could continue the conversation for many more hours. I would highly encourage our listeners and our followers to read his book. It's excellent. It's such a moving and well-written book. A Day in the Life of Abed Salama-Anatomy of a Jerusalem Tragedy. Thank you for taking the time to write it. Thank you for sharing it with the world. And thank you for taking time to speak with us today.
Thank you for having me.
We're so fortunate to have your voice, and we look forward to your next book.
Thank you. Really a pleasure to be with you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights Podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights Podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.